Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Continuing on from last week's episode from the Crops Forum, this week's episode focuses on the fertiliser supply and potential costs for 2023. Andy Doyle moderates the session with panel members from across the industry, including Kieran McEvoy from the IFA, Clive Carter from the Irish Grain Growers, Donal Maloney from Tirlán, Enda McDonald from Grassland Agro, Bill Callanan from the Department of Agriculture, and Ciarán Collins, a tillage specialist in Teagasc.
Will there be fertiliser, and or what will be the biggest pressure in the fertiliser market for the year ahead?
I suppose, Andy, the first thing I'd like to say is I noticed in your introduction you were introducing me as representing the fertiliser industry, but sure, I'll take the hospital pass anyway. Look at, I suppose, the lads are saying about risk, and it's all about managing risk. I suppose, look at we'll say as regards to fertiliser supply chain and everything else in this country, we've always traditionally bought in a huge amount of fertiliser at the back end of the year. We respected, when it comes to January, February, March, there was always fertiliser available. The problem is now in the supply chain, stuff has gone so expensive, and even the capital to spend money on these shipments and stuff to bring them in now, it's too much. It's a capital scenario in trying to get the capital to buy the stuff in the first place, and then it's a stock risk actually carrying it. So the supply chain needs to change in that, we'll say, and this is even from a gas perspective, I suppose, this is happening right up from manufacturer level right down to farm level. And I suppose the manufacturers are not buying gas. We've seen it in the last couple of weeks where there's manufacturers all across Europe are shutting down plants. They're shutting down plants because the gas that's coming in to make the ammonium means that the output that's coming out of those factories could be, you could be looking at can on a European gas scale at the moment costing something like 1,200 euros to produce. And I suppose we're not giving them the support to buy stuff at the 1,200 euros. We're not getting the support from the merchant level. The merchant's not getting it from the farmer. So the whole chain is kind of dysfunctional at the moment. And I think that it's very important what the lads are saying. I know in other years, there's a lot of guys would be very reluctant to buy inputs and to sell outputs. But I think in the risk that we're heading into 2023, and somebody mentioned it there, it could be a bogey year. Like this, buying stuff and selling your output and taking the margin that's there could be a very sensible thing to do, because it's kind of like going into Paddy Power and putting money on. Like anything could happen between now, and somebody mentioned an egotistical maniac earlier on. He's still not gone away, and anything could happen in the gas market or at manufacturing level. So like, I think it's very important what the guys are saying about managing risk, and I think that guys will have to take on board, like what Donal is saying, and Kieran and the lads, like we're going to have to, we'll say, manage the risk a bit more. And whether that's taking forward sales or buying inputs forward, I think everybody's going to have a look at.
Yeah, I think in fairness to Clive's point, that you're prepared to go if you can get the inputs. And I think the big question is, will we get them? Can we get them? I won't say regardless of the price. That would be a very flippant comment for somebody like me to make. But, from the beginning of this year, in conversations with farmers, I would always have replied that the price will not be the issue next year. And that seems to be the way it could potentially go. There's two things I think in it, and Enda, before I leave you, I think one is what the price will be and the overall availability. But the other issue is that Ireland is not a big overall market for fertilizers. We may use a relatively big amount per acre per hectare, but I don't know that we would necessarily be number one in terms of the needs when we're particularly being pushed onto new supply lines, because that's what the disruption of the. Am I wrong in that?
Well, I suppose, look, we're in a unique situation in that Ireland is probably one of the only countries in Europe that actually doesn't produce their own fertilizer. So I suppose with manufacturers, that we were in a scenario where last season before the war broke out, there's maybe 40% of the fertilizer is coming out of Russia. Probably the vast majority of that was either in the country or it was on ships on the way here. So when the situation developed at the end of February, we weren't in that bad of a scenario because we had a lot of the fertilizer in already. Now we're facing into a scenario where we need to buy 100% of our supply from 60% of the availability. But now the 60% of the availability is now being shut off. So we have to go outside of Europe. And there is fertilizer available. There's urea available. There's urea available from the States, from Trinidad, all these places, even though we have to pay tariffs to get it in here. But I suppose it's a small price to pay, we'll say, versus trying to buy European source stuff. But the problem is with that, and it's coming back to your question of will fertilizer be available? It will be available once the supply chain all the way up along is putting their hands up and saying they want a product. It's not a case of whereas we'll say in years gone by, we had a scenario where if we wanted potash, for example, we could put our hands up to a trader, we could buy potash, we could get it in maybe within 3 weeks. Whereas now you're looking at buying, or urea was the same. You could go to a trader, there was stuff available, there was volumes of stuff in various different locations around Europe. That's not there at the moment. So if we're looking to buy urea at the moment, we could be looking at going to Indonesia or Americas or somewhere, and you're in contact with a trader. It could take up to 2-3 months to get product in. So product will be available, but it's just the whole way along the supply chain, including ourselves, merchants, farmers, everybody has to be clued in advance this time.
Okay, so it's a case of who's willing to join the dots will be the ones that will be in the business. Kieran, just before we leave that point, and to some degree, I think the question was maybe answered by one of the previous Teagasc speakers, but you know, we're looking at this massive increase in cost on the fertilizer side. We're looking at other inflationary costs coming in on most other elements of input. I was asked the question yesterday, and I'm passing it straight back to you. Should farmers be considering the option of going to, not maybe all the way to organic, which was the first question, but going to a lower input scenario?
I think it's a difficult one to answer, because generally higher output in Ireland has paid the bills. So I suppose that's the first point. I think there are within the fertilizer, because when you do look at the figures, it's fertilizer is driving those big changes. And like when I was doing those figures there last week, I mean, protected urea was actually, I think it was about 30% cheaper than Ken. People tell me that has actually changed. It's actually, that differential is larger now. So I think that's one thing that we need to look at. It's not business as usual doing what we always did. The second part I think that's valuable is nutrient management planning. You know, again, there are soils out there that are index 4 for P and K. I think there's certainly savings can be made there. And I obviously with the new nitrates anyway, we can put out phosphorus without a soil sample to tell us that we can do that. So I think there is scope, you know, and there's certainly scope with organic manures. Again, it's not for everyone. It won't be available to everyone, and they do come with a cost. But, you know, on the Signpost Farms this year, we did a very successful looks at, you know, even in-crop spreading of organic manure. So I think all of those things have to be on the table rather than just taking, I put out X units of N every year. And, you know, and that does make a big difference when you drill down into it.
Kieran, before I leave that one, like, is there any evidence that there is going to be a willingness for a flow of nutrients through organic manures, other than, say, the pig or the poultry industry? Will they be the major ones for most people?
I still think that's going to be the case, yeah. You know, certainly look from dairying, there obviously is scope in certain areas, yeah, but pig and poultry will be, and its location, I mean, you know, if you're not in the area. Yeah.
Okay. Can I slip across to Bill at the other side? Bill, there was a question pending that came to Fran vis-a-vis the crop diversification necessity in the new cap was probably the question, but realistically the big question is around the rumour, what about 2023? Is it there for 2023?
Yeah, look, I'm going to come at it actually from the beginning though, because just listening, and I think it's a very good conversation we're having. So look at it as a government. I'm not a guru here. I don't have all the answers, but just we do regulate and we enable the industry, and you're kind of looking at how do we facilitate the conversation so there's a sharing of knowledge. So the first message I'd like to give is just that there is significant support for the sector from government and from the minister in terms of, look at where are we at in the sector, where do we need to be at, and what are the drivers of those. And the two drivers that are clear and evident to everybody are, we've had the Ukraine crisis, which has a major impact in terms of global fertilizer, be it from Russia, and grain coming from Ukraine. And whatever the challenge we have in certain areas of the world, that's even existential. So what I mean by that is very simple. We depend on grain coming in here as part of our feedstock for the national herd or for usage. But you take areas like North Africa, they're actually dependent on it for feed for people. You know, and if you look at the Arab Spring, which was 2011 or 12 or whatever, that was all arising from inability to feed people. The bread price, the price of wheat had a massive political issue. So there's an inherent risk from a food security of having a destabilizing effect. And how do you manage that? At the same time, then we have the whole principle of the Green Deal, and how do we reduce the impact on the environment, and how I suppose as a department, we support industry in terms of achieving those objectives. So you're looking for support measures that maybe tick a number of those boxes. And that's what really generated the likes of the Straw Incorporation scheme, which was very, I think, welcomed by the industry and has been very positive. As one industry person said to me, it sorts out, well, it improves land, it sorts out surplus straw, and it sorts out bad payers. So I suppose it's multiple objectives, and that would have been the driver in terms of the value of the scheme. And it was over 30,000 hectares last year, and I think it's nearly 50,000 hectares in this year. So from that perspective, the other side then was looking at our vulnerability nationally. We're only 16 weeks self-sufficient in grain, and that would have driven the development of the tillage incentive scheme in terms of how do we get back some of that 50,000 hectares that we've lost since 2012. So we had a decline of about 50,000 hectares. There has been an increase last year, about 9,000 hectares. We're certainly over 20,000 hectares additionality this year. I won't say the tillage scheme is responsible for it all, but certainly has supported that. So we've clawed back some of that from a policy. So just as an overall. On the specific question then you asked, which is, we are entering a new CAP. We've heard a lot of material today. There may be a lot of uncertainty in relation to it as you deal with it at individual farm level. But for cropping next year, the Minister recently announced a derogation in relation to the application of that, which effectively means it's a farmer's decision what crops they plant next year, because you don't have the application of the crop rotation or the crop diversification required. So it's available to farmers to make that decision based on the best advice that Teagasc would give, or Andy will give in the journal, I'm sure, and taking account of what you'll hear in terms of fertiliser or the guides. The one thing I would draw attention to is to recognise that as Kieran really identified, was that if you look at that protein aid, we're going from 3 million to 7 million. That's absolutely certain for next year in terms of its availability. And if you look at the acreage this year, like it was static or fell slightly. So I would have thought a crop like that, or protein crops, let's say, there is an opportunity in terms of growing that because the aid rate will increase. It's not going to just keep going up, etc. But it has the potential to be significantly higher than it is today. And I'll let the guys talk about that, and people can have that choice. But the bottom line is, there was a press release out last week, identified the derogation available for next year that people can crop as they wish. And people should just read that and see, well, look at how does it look. I'd still remind people, though, you need to be thinking longer term then in terms of crop rotation and how compliance, we just don't walk away from it next year, but rather the crop mix and how it will contribute to long-term eligibility for crop rotation.
Okay, Bill, thanks. Look, this forum is open to everybody in the audience. So if people have questions, get the hands up online, get the hands up. Are there some sitting online, Dermot? Okay, let's just try and deal with a couple of those. Or there can be a change of issues. It doesn't have to stay with the areas where we've been so far.
Yeah, there's just a couple here online. One is really kind of gathering together the thing on forward set, or the availability of forward prices. And the kind of question is this, I suppose, the risk at this point is phenomenal. We need forward prices on fertiliser and grain together at a minimum. In other words, the two prices being available on the same day for someone to make a decision. So I think that's been partly dealt with, but I think they're asking the industry, can they provide those two prices at the one time together, fertiliser and grain?
I'll just take that one, Dermot, and we'll go ahead. Donal, if I can drop that on you, because I know you don't have either of them today for the future, but you will understand the dilemma that all growers everywhere are in. That, to make the commitment that either Clive or Kieran are talking about, it would be almost obligatory for the year ahead, even though it still may not happen and people will go as they always did because we're optimists by nature. Is it practical for the industry, possible for the industry to contemplate being able to offer both on the same day?
Yeah, well, it's no issue with the grain, I suppose, and most people will be aware that Tirlán, I have to think about that every time I say it now, but that Tirlán have been kind of leading the way maybe with offering forward prices over the last number of years, and we do have a text message go out most weeks on green and dried prices. We haven't been offering 2023 prices yet, and that's simply just not to confuse, I suppose, until we're finished the 2022 harvest in its entirety. But there are prices available, I suppose, any day for 2023 on grain and oilseed rape and possibly beans. On the fertiliser, we will have offers coming, and there has been a cash offer available, I suppose, over the last couple of weeks through the business manager team for people, and there will be further cash offers. To say that there'll be a grain price and a fertiliser price available every day might be, a little difficult just at the moment, but there'll certainly be a grain price, and there'll be fertiliser prices, I would say, regularly over the next number of months, or fertiliser offers available regularly over the next number of months from our side anyway.
Clive?
Just one thing on top of that, Andy. Something else that needs to be looked at from a farmer's point of view as well is price insurance. Can offer, particularly in this level of volatility, can offer farmers great risk reduction. I know it's in its infancy at the minute, but there's great potential there for farmers.
Can I step back to Bill for a second? Bill, can government or the department do anything to help get that supply chain kicked off on the fertiliser side in particular? Is it possible to try and encourage people to join the dots from an official perspective?
So I suppose look at just at department level, we have regular meetings, let's say within internally with a Ukraine group, let's say, to take all the issues. We meet with the fertiliser industry regularly, and I want to be absolutely clear. I don't want to be suggested as pro or again different sides of this, just articulating what we're hearing. And I suppose one of the things I have said around the fertiliser industry, is that internationally, fundamentally, there's a difference in structure in that, the fertiliser industry, where it's producing and selling, the price determines their profit in many ways. But I do have to recognise that structurally in Ireland, there's a difference in that they're wholesaling, that are buying and selling, and that does add a certain different dynamic. It will be for individuals certainly to make a decision in relation to that. But what we did do in terms of trying to coordinate a clarity from industry in particular was to set up the fodder group under Mike McCann. That's been meeting in relation to stocks of fodder, etc. And, it needs to continually consider these different issues, from a stakeholder point of view, so everybody at least has sight and they can make decisions based on the information as best it's made available, So they're the fora in terms of where we try and ensure and I suppose facilitate discussion between the stakeholders rather than give guidance. And I'm not going to give guidance in terms of fertiliser, but it is clear that in dynamic and certainly in our engagement in industry that it does stand out to me that there's a different structure in relation to that adds a risk, and people then have to make decisions at farm level being aware of that.
Enda, you want to add to that?
Just to come in there on your original question you're asking, Donal, I suppose the problem with the forward sale of fertiliser prices today and the grain price is we actually can't, and I spoke about at the start of this dysfunctional supply chain. I suppose we cannot avail of a forward purchasing system for fertiliser. The only way we can actually forward buy fertiliser today is if we pick up the phone to the trader and we physically buy the product. Yeah. And even it's gone so volatile at the moment that we even seen a scenario 2 weeks ago when the gas price started taking, well, it actually hadn't taken the welly upwards. It was maybe 11. This is how crazy the thing is. 11 o'clock of a Tuesday morning, we were offered a cargo of urea. By 2 o'clock, we decided to take it. We went to go back to the trader. We couldn't actually get in contact with him. He rang us back on the Thursday and the price had gone up $185. So we can't, and that's why I suppose the question earlier on was asked, will there be fertiliser available or not? Fertiliser would be available at a price. And what I'm saying is everything needs to be organised forward this season, because it's not a suck it and see job and say, right, I'm going to plant stuff now and I'm going to just look at it, it'll happen. They always have fertiliser. That's not going to be the case because the risk is so big to carry stock at the moment, and it's the volume of money that's involved in actually bankrolling the stock to have it sitting in the yard is too great at the moment.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Andy and all the panel members for joining me on the podcast. In order to understand the aspects of the podcast which are most appealing and beneficial to you, I would greatly appreciate if you could take 3 to 4 minutes to complete the survey. The details of this are in the podcast notes. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.